Good evening to you all. I want to give you a very warm welcome to the 21st Manchester Wesley Research Center Annual Lecture. And we want to welcome you who are here in the chapel tonight, as well as those of you who are listening online, or those of you who will be listening to the recording of this event. I'm David Bundy, Interim Director of the MWRC, and I first would like to thank the International Board of Education of the Church of the Nazarene for their generous sponsorship of this lecture. I would also like to name publicly and thank the partner institutions who, together with us here, have a quite dynamic and interesting partnership of institutions that engage individually and collectively in research on the Methodist and Wesleyan traditions, and a whole bunch of other folks who we represent individually and as institutions. In Argentina, there is the Universidad del Centro Educativo. In Canada, the Tyndale University and Seminary. In Germany, the Reutlingen School of Theology. In the UK, Cliff College, the John Rylands Research Institute and Library, the Nazarene Theological College, where we are housed and have our being, Religions and Theology at the University of Manchester, and Wesley House, Cambridge. In the USA, institutions who are partners include Asbury Theological Seminary, Asbury University, Boston University School of Theology, the Methodist Library at Drew University, Nazarene Theological Seminary in Kansas City, Pentecostal Theological Seminary in Cleveland, Tennessee, Point Loma Nazarene University in San Diego, Wesley Seminary at Indiana Wesleyan University, and the International Board of Education of the Church of the Nazarene, which is based in the USA, but represents Nazarene higher education around the world. The intellectual, spiritual, and financial contributions of the partner institutions are what makes the MWRC a vibrant community of scholars, faculty, and visiting scholars. And we gather in various places in Europe and North America, and increasingly in Latin America, to learn from each other and to share our research. I would also like to thank the MWRC team for the crucial contributions that each of these people make to the center. Howard Snyder, who is one of our international representatives, our official one. Jordan Hammond, who has left us but not yet. Jacob Lett, Robert Card, Joshua Tupper, John Darby, and Mark Olson. Each of them play an important part of what we are here and as we reach around in other places. The administrative team at Nazarene Theological College deserves our grateful thanks for the facilitating of the work and supporting the work of the MWC here on the ground, as we say, in Didsbury. Now, regarding logistics, we have roughly an hour for the lecture. This will be followed by with questions and discussion, including from our friends who are online, and you will be given instructions about how to connect online to type your questions. They will be read here, and we will let Randy decide if he wants to respond to them. But tonight, I have the distinct honor and pleasure to introduce to you this year's lecturer, the Reverend Dr. Professor Emeritus, Randy Maddox. Randy is an ordained minister in the United Methodist Church. Until till 2020, he served as the William Kellon Quick Professor of Wesleyan and Methodist Studies at Duke, and he's now the William Kellon Professor Emeritus of Wesleyan and Methodist Studies. He is the general editor of the Wesley Works Project, which is a major scholarly project for producing the first comprehensive critical and annotated edition of the works of John Wesley. He is not only an editor of text, and that is not to diminish editors of text, but he has established himself as a leading authority of the theology of Wesley and the Wesleyan traditions and of its developments in the various Wesleyan movements. He was graduated from the Northwest Nazarene College in Nampa, Idaho. He did his MDiv at Nazarene Theological Seminary and his PhD at Emory University. His scholarly career includes periods at 3 institutions or 4, depending on how you count them. I first met him when he was at Sioux Falls College in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which is now University of Sioux Falls, and he was more or less simultaneously part of that time teaching at the North American Baptist Seminary at now Sioux Falls Seminary. He became the Paul T. Walls Professor of Wesleyan Theology at Seattle Pacific University, where he served from 1998 to 2005, when he left the Northwest to go off to North Carolina to work at and teach and share and do transformative work at the Duke Divinity School. His publications are legion, and at the bottom of your outline, you will see a website where you can go visit lots of them. But just to mention some of the ones that I have been shaped by myself, one of his early volumes, Toward an Ecumenical Fundamental Theology, was and still is a very interesting piece. His Responsible Grace, John Wesley's Practical Theology, to me is one of the most important volumes that's ever been written on Methodist theology. But he's just kept working, and one of the things that he has done that I think is really admirable, he has worked to bring people together to reflect about things. He has a large number of edited volumes. And now editing a volume, as some of you know who have tried that, is hard work. It's like herding cats, chasing geese, trying to capture a swan, these kinds of, but he kept doing that. I've got a long list of these. I think I've 9 or so. There's probably more. But it's the bringing together speaks a lot about Randy. Randy, we look forward to hearing your lecture on 2 really interesting, crucially important individuals who are important to all of the traditions that grow out of and are related to the Wesleyan experience. His title tonight, Charles Wesley and Lady Huntingdon, Erstwhile, Best of Friends. Randy?
It is my pleasure to be here. I consider it an honor to be invited and to be part of this and to have all of you turn out on a nice day when you could be out doing something else to listen to a lecture. My early lectures tended to be often on Wesleyan theology. Over the last few years, as I accepted the role and then was pushed into the role of being general editor of the Wesley Works, it's moved more and more into producing critical editions of materials and annotating those. And this lecture will reflect that because it grows out of some work I did trying to track everyone that's writing to John and Charles Wesley, as well as their writings to others. And finding out that to do that, I was going to have to give up and learn how to read Byram's shorthand because of all of this stuff in shorthand in Charles Wesley's collection. In this lecture, I want to explore the intertwined lives of Charles Wesley and of Selina Shirley Hastings, Countess of Huntingdon, both born in 1707. She dies 3 years after Charles does. And I'll look, when relevant, to their connections with John Wesley. While a few studies of Lady Huntingdon and the Wesley brothers have been published, all of them that I had found previously have focused on her relationship primarily with John. And I think that's primarily because most of the material that you need to see Charles's role was not available to most readers, including most scholarly readers. The shorthand sections of the manuscript journal were where he often talked about his interactions, some of them that we'll look at that were divisive at times, and most of that shorthand wasn't expanded until we get to the 2008 edition of the manuscript journal. Correspondence, likewise. Not all of Charles's stuff was known, but more importantly, we had a volume called the Manuscript Shorthand Letters. The first half of that we had worked on because it was shorthand transcriptions of letters written between the Wesley family. The second half, I'd just seen folks refer to it. I'd never seen anybody describe what it was. And when I got into it, it turned out to be almost 60 Charles Wesley shorthand copies of almost 60 letters between him and the Countess of Huntingdon. Most of them her letters to him. And that opened up a new window to look into their relationship. And so what I'll be doing tonight is to try to draw together out of the manuscript journal sections, the journal letters, out of these letters that we're writing between them, to paint a picture that's a very different picture than the one that I had assumed coming up to this point. I had assumed that Charles, by and large, through his life, saw Lady Huntingdon as an adversary, that she was a Calvinist, he was not. But that's not the story. That's the story that was often told. I had assumed that Charles always saw John Wesley as his partner in ministry. I will argue tonight that when you draw on all these resources, you will find, number one, that Lady Huntingdon was closer to Charles Wesley than his brother John from the very beginning of their acquaintance with one another. And more importantly, we will find that Charles viewed Lady Huntingdon as a closer friend and advisor in his work in ministry for almost 20 years than his brother John. That will fracture at the end, but that period is an important and shaping one. So you have the outline. I'll follow along the main points. And the sources I refer to, let me say, as is on the outline, this is based on an article that will appear in Wesleyan Methodist Studies with 150 footnotes. If you need the notes, write me and I'm glad to send you a pre-publication copy of where all this that I'm drawing from comes. Lady Huntingdon had no apparent contact with the Wesley family prior to the missionary postings of Charles and John in Georgia. Her initial exposure to the evangelical revival that emerged upon their return to Britain was mediated through a third member of that missionary group, Benjamin Ingham. Back in England, Ingham was drawn into the Moravian orbit and helped plant their presence in Yorkshire. And here he proved instrumental to the conversion of Lady Margaret Hastings, who was Selina's sister-in-law. Lady Margaret, in turn, introduced Ingham to Lord and Lady Huntingdon during their visit to Ledstone in July 1739, a visit that Lady Huntingdon once called the beginning of the, quote, good work of the Lord in her life. Some identify it as her conversion. Given their mutual acquaintance with Ingham, Charles Wesley and Lady Huntingdon undoubtedly heard about each other then after 1739, but when did they actually meet? The most that can be said with confidence is that it was in early 1741. It is unlikely, and that was when she had come down with her husband for a meeting of Parliament. They had a house down in London for whenever Parliament was in session. It is unlikely when they did come down that spring of 1741 that Lady Huntingdon began attending preaching services at the Foundry regularly, as some have asserted, particularly Seymour. Her status would have kept her in a Church of England setting for regular worship. Ministerial encounters with the Wesley brothers were typically at her residence instead. For example, Lady Huntingdon stressed in a letter to both brothers the comfort that Charles had ministered to her soul on Easter Sunday, March 29th, 1741, calling it, quote, one of the happiest days of her life. Now, it's easy to imagine that this happened when she was listening to a sermon that Charles preached. But records show that it was John Wesley who preached both the morning and the evening service that day at the Foundry. More likely, Charles, if he was preaching, was doing it in her parlor. But it is also possible that he was just meeting with her to pray and sing, because in her letter at the time, she says, your prayers I daily feel, and your brothers. Oh, the prayer of faith is mighty indeed. A million thanks for your hymns. I love them extremely. So it wasn't about a sermon at all that she focused on, but prayers and hymns. Actually, regular attendance by the Countess at worship services officiated by the Wesley brothers can be demonstrated only after John Wesley arranged to purchase a former Huguenot building in which on West Street in London. Well, it was Anglican-owned, the Huguenots had worshiped in it, on West Street in London, and where they introduced worship following the Book of Common Prayer, including celebrating the sacrament. From 1743 on, John Wesley is holding Book of England worship in London proper next to other churches and celebrating the sacrament. That's when Lady Huntingdon started coming to Wesley Brothers services. They actually had a seat reserved specially for her in that chapel. Charles' ability to minister to Lady Huntingdon in March 1741 actually owed itself to her prior ministry to him. In late December 1740, John left Charles in charge of their work in London, while he went off to address problems among their flock in the Bristol area. Some of the followers in both cities were drawing antinomian implications from the Calvinist notion of unconditional election and/or the English Moravian construal of justification by faith alone as requiring stillness. In mid-January 1741, however, John heard that Charles was himself inclining towards the stillness teaching. Hurrying back to London on Thursday morning, the 22nd of January, John picked up preaching at the Foundry, where Charles had abruptly left off 2 mornings earlier, saying that he would never preach again. He would be still. But on the 12th of February, a week or so later, Charles left London for Oxford. But on the 12th of February, John recorded triumphantly in his journal, my brother returned from Oxford and preached on, quote, the true way of waiting for God, namely in the means of grace, thereby dispelling at once the fears of some and the vain hopes of others who had confidently affirmed that Mr. Charles Wesley was still already and would come to London no more. Now, what's of interest for us is that in Lady Huntingdon's account of this, she claims she was the hand through which God ministered to save Charles from the Quietists. So we're seeing at the very beginnings of the relationship, the two are ministering to each other in ways that are helping draw them together. Indeed, her letters, those particularly among the shorthand letters that are available now in their expanded form in one of the items on your list. In her letters, it becomes clear that the Countess was drawn to the Wesley brothers in 1741 in significant part because she shared their concern about antinomian extremes in the emerging revival. Her surviving letter to John, dated April 2, 1741, was hand-delivered by a man who had been a strong predestinarian and was now trying to flay it off. She sent him to John and commended him to John's care to help him rid himself of that kind of predestinarianism. Writing to Charles a couple months later, the Countess affirmed that Satan's still devices, that theme of being still, were no longer a challenge for her because, quote, a short experience of that doctrine will make us believe, as still ones do, that there is no Christian holiness. She added, to declare these truths, it seems to me as if you and your brother only are intended for. All have so remarkably fallen that have had any share with you, but I think you will remain his faithful witnesses. It's very interesting. Now, from all I can tell, Countess Huntingdon was a mild predestinarian all of her life and became more adamant about that later. She was Church of England, and the article on predestination is a single predestinarian article, though it can be read in an Arminian way, which John and Charles did. Now, the English Moravians were the top of the list of those whom the Countess judged in this mid-1741 letter to have remarkably fallen. But she also expressed concern in a letter to John on 19th of February, 1742, about a meeting with George Whitefield, in which, quote, he held forth above 2 hours upon the doctrine of election and reprobation. And when he finished, the Countess said she told Whitefield that she, quote, should be such a loser by his way of thinking because, again, quote, she waited and hoped for an absolute deliverance from sin, which he was willing to groan under always, end quote. So while some point to that letter as evidence that Lady Huntingdon embraced the full Arminian stance of the Wesley brothers, I think it's important to see that her emphasis was narrower. She shared their commitment at that point to holiness in this life and saw them as the defenders of that doctrine, and to the degree they were, she wanted to add her support. Okay, second section, growing closeness of relationship. Now here I'm focusing on the Countess and Charles in particular. Lady Huntingdon's early letters to John and Charles Wesley address each as dear friend. In one, she insisted that the only persons to whom she was willing to declare God's blessings in her life were the two brothers. And yet, one can have favorites among your dear friends, right? In a letter from mid-April 1741, after mentioning John, Lady Huntingdon said to Charles, I feel my heart more open to you, but I cannot tell why. But I love him with great warmth. A couple months later, she suggested a reason. My moments are so few with your brother that I cannot open my soul. How glad I shall be to see you, because you'll stay here and spend some time. The shorthand records of the first 2 years of their correspondence confirm that Lady Huntingdon opened her soul to Charles, sharing her spiritual joys and struggles, soliciting his prayers, and assuring him of her prayers. What about Charles in return? Few of his letters to Lady Huntingdon in these early years survive, and we have the reason in one of these letters. He asked her to burn them after she read them. But in the replies that she sends to those letters she received, it becomes clear that Charles was not as open with her as she was being with him. In a letter from mid-September 1741, she reprimanded Charles that she could not offer appropriate prayers for his spiritual deliverance because, quote, your heart is not open to me as mine is to you. Something lies at the bottom and torments you. In one of his few surviving letters to her, Charles conceded the point. Quote, I have in me what would break any heart but mine, that I have no one person upon earth to whom I can open my heart. Now understand, John's included in that category. Not one to whom I can open my heart. Charles's relationship with the Countess was relatively new. It needed time for trust to grow, for him to open his heart to her. The many affirmations sprinkled through Lady Huntingdon's letters over those next few years continued to nurture this trust. She encouraged Charles to have that confidence of yourself, which I always feel for you, and she repeatedly assured him of the blessings God had bestowed on her through their friendship, once calling Charles, quote, the first cause in God's hand for 2 years of every spiritual blessing I possess. Perhaps nothing drew Lady Huntingdon and Charles Wesley closer together in those years than sharing a role as instruments in God's hand for the spiritual welfare of others. I think in particular of two young women, Anne Cowper and her sister Frances, or Fanny Cowper, who lived near the Huntingdons' London house. These two sisters, their mother died when they were younger, their father was now deceased, were friends of the Huntingdon, of Selina and her husband. And shortly after Charles returned to London from Bristol in September 1741, he was instrumental in their evangelical conversion. Since they knew Lady Huntingdon, he then entrusted them to her as their spiritual mentor or for their spiritual care. In a letter to Charles in late October 1741, Lady Huntingdon describes them as, quote, your first fruit of East Barnet, the town they were from. A couple days later, she assured him that the Cowpers are in the highest measure of love that I have seen, and added, the joy that I have felt on their account is more than tongue can tell. So their mutual ministry is binding them together. In early February 1742, Lady Huntingdon took the Cowper sisters with her to Bath, a place she visited for its famed waters when in poor health. Part of the reason for the trip was that Fanny Cowper was ailing, and indeed, over the next few months, Fanny would die first, and then Anne would die months later. And in that period, Lady Huntingdon cared for them, and Charles was in constant correspondence and would come up to visit to share in that caring and helping to deal with the aftermath of that. This is significant because Lady Huntingdon's information conveying to Charles when the funeral would be for Anne Cowper was signed, farewell, quote, my best of friends. Not just my friend or dear friend, but my best of friends. This heightened affirmation of affection was due to more than Charles's support of Lady Huntingdon through the suffering of the Cowper sisters. Over the same period, she lost 3 sons to illness. Her letters to Charles during this time focused on, quote, the love unreserved that he ministered to her soul, which helped her to accept those losses. Once again, the support that Charles gave Lady Huntingdon was sustained in part by support she was providing to him. 1742 was filled with challenges and losses for Charles Wesley, so much so that he omitted the entire year in his manuscript journal. In addition to continued struggles with proponents of stillness in London and Bristol, through the first 3 months, Charles was crafting a formal sermon that he had to deliver at the University of Oxford. And he had no sooner finished that sermon than he rushed back to Lady Huntingdon to be with her at Fanny's decline and death. And he had no sooner gotten through that than on 8th of June, Charles received word of the unexpected death of another close friend and supporter, Robert Jones of Fonman Castle, near Cardiff of Wales. Charles channeled his grief into an extended elegy that he wrote for Jones. And just as he was wrapping this up, he received a letter from his brother John informing him that their mother Susanna had died on 30th of July and would be buried the 1st of August. By the time Charles received this news in Bristol, the funeral was past. The needs of ministry limited Charles's time to, quote, grieve, as he was back laboring in Bristol by mid-August, wishing he could, and here's the quote, lay down my load and be no more. He's in the depths of despair from all of this. Instead of laying down his load, he was sent to attend to the nascent work in Newcastle, and the accumulated stress of these events surely contributed to the illness that Lady Huntingdon expressed concerns about when she wrote to Charles late that year, assuring him of her ardent prayers. One other major thread that binds them together, I'm trying to explain how they were drawn together as such close friends. Not only they ministered to each other, they shared in ministry to others. One other thread was partnership in mission. Within months of meeting the Wesley brothers, Lady Huntingdon requested that they consider her as a, quote, laborer with you in the Lord's work. Well, John was wary of this from the beginning, I think mainly because he recognized that she was like he, namely wanted to be top, not second or paired, and neither would give in to the other. But also, how can you be a fellow laborer if you're not ordained in ministry? John was not open to it. Charles, by contrast, was. The correspondence between Charles Wesley and the Countess make clear his embrace of her as a co-laborer in ministry. One form this took was the care for the Cowper sisters and the letters that she'd write about that, etc. Indeed, these turned into a formal type of correspondence. Charles kept, quote, journal letters where he kept a record of his ministry, and he would send a copy to his brother John all the time, reporting in kind of, this is what I've done the last week. He began to send the same to Lady Huntingdon, and she began to write journal letters of her own describing her ministry and send them to Charles. The degree to which the two saw themselves as co-laborers is evidenced by a proposal raised in a couple of the journal letters that Lady Huntingdon wrote Charles. She mentioned that she had begun praying that God would convince Charles to take a parish near her house in Enfield Chase down in London to assist in turning it or the surrounding community village into a community holding all things in common as a nursery for those pursuing Christian holiness. Come down here and help us create the model Christian village, a village of true Christian holiness. By the summer of 1743, the various dynamics we have been tracing built such a level of affection and trust between the two that each was ready to pour out their hearts to others. Charles had not been ready to do this 2 years earlier. On the 5th of July, in the midst of Annie Cowper's final illness, Lady Huntingdon wrote freely to Charles of, quote, the darkness, perplexity, and misery that constantly surrounded her, worse than at any time since her conversion, and rendered it impossible to pray for anything, even for Charles, except for God's mercy on her, the chief of sinners. She could be that open about her struggle at the moment. The same week, Charles Wesley, amidst renewed struggles with predestinarians and advocates of stillness in London, wrote to Lady Huntingdon, addressed to, quote, my only friend, to pour out his griefs that, quote, shame, fear, anger, wrath, and pride are tearing my soul in pieces, and urge her to pray that God would allow him to die. Not quite the prayer I would have asked for, but he's urging her to prayer. Ever prone to work through issues in verse, the day that Charles wrote to Lady Huntingdon this, he read an extended poem to the society in London that he titled, quote, Epistle to a Friend. Within the epistle, it becomes clear that Lady Huntingdon is the assumed recipient of the letter. She's the friend whom Charles addresses within the poem as, quote, my more than friend, quote, my partner of all my cares, quote, my best of friends, second only to Christ, and, quote, a friend above all title and esteem. She is, after all, Lady Huntingdon, Countess. We've reached a point where both are referring to each other as best of friends, the one they could really share their Christian walk with. But now we need to begin to look toward what will come, and I have a section titled Emerging Theological Divergence. Lady Huntingdon's advice to her best of friends at this time, when he complained about the stillness and the predestinarians, was for him to, quote, consider them nothing. Just don't pay any attention to it. By 1770, she would be championing predestination herself, in specific contrast to the Wesley brothers, and it would lead to a split between the two movements. What facilitated this shift? In her 1742 letter to John Wesley, recounting George Whitfield's defense of predestination, it's important to notice that the Countess said that the manner and tone of Whitfield's defense inclined her against the doctrine he was expositing more than any of his arguments for it. How he presented it was as much the issue as anything. Thus, one prerequisite for coming to question the Arminian stance of her, quote, best of friends would be for Lady Huntingdon to encounter proponents of Calvinism whose temperament she found more winsome. And ironically, Charles Wesley introduced the Countess to such a person when he brought Howell Harris to her house on the 26th of August, 1743. Now, Harris was a rough kind of person, not Lady Huntingdon's culture, but what she appreciated about him was that he tried to be a peacemaker between the Reformed or the Calvinists and the Arminian camps. Harris, in turn, introduced Lady Huntingdon to James Erskine in May 1744, and through the influence of Harris, Erskine, and others, Lady Huntingdon was convinced that Calvinist and Arminian evangelicals could differ on predestination while working together to foster practical Christianity. The key point there, we can differ on these doctrines as long as we stay focused on practical Christianity. But Harris and Erskine also conveyed to her their judgment, like that of George Whitefield, that emphasis on present Christian perfection was averse to practical Christianity. It didn't encourage it, it worked against it, they argued. We noted above Lady Huntingdon's insistence in 1742 that she hoped for an absolute deliverance from sin in this life. This is what drew her to the Wesleys, and her letters to Charles Wesley over the coming months continued to reflect this hope, but they also reflect emphases about Christian perfection prominent in Charles' hymns at the time. The hymns cast Christian perfection as a full renewal of character in a single experience subsequent to our conversion that is received unilaterally and instantaneously from God through prayer. The continuing elusiveness of such an experience would lead Lady Huntingdon by June 1747 to explicitly reject, quote, sinless perfection and the instantaneous gift of sanctification as the Wesley's brothers hold. So what had drawn her to him in 1741, by then she was ready to say, I don't accept that anymore. Now, how could that happen? Well, it's because there was a sudden fracture in the relationship between Charles Wesley and Lady Huntingdon, or at least this played a role. The sharpness with which she came to reject instantaneous sanctification was due not only to being surrounded by some who questioned it, but being cut off from her former best of friends who could have spoken in its favor, even though Charles himself would come to speak against it in many ways in the 1760s. At that point, he was a defender of it. This sudden fracture in the relationship of our two focal figures had little to do with doctrine, something to do with polity, and much to do with conflicts that arise from human pride, insecurity, and spite. The roots of the fracture go back to 1744. Thomas Williams, son of a respected family in Wales, was converted under the preaching of Charles Wesley in 1741 and served for a time as an itinerant Methodist preacher. But then he became alienated from the Wesley brothers, and as part of that alienation, he began to publicize allegations that were later withdrawn. Indeed, he seems to have encouraged that they be made in the first place, of immoral sexual conduct by Charles, including an allegation referring to one Elizabeth Story, who was a single woman member of the Foundry Society. The details of that are told elsewhere. You'll find the article there talking about Ellen's story if you want to read all the details of what was going on and how it was withdrawn. Our interest in this lecture is how it impacted Charles's relationship with the Countess. Charles first heard of Williams's efforts to cast aspersions on his character on the 11th of August, 1744, and by the following month he is being pressed by friends to answer the charges. Well, it was natural that he would seek Lady Huntingdon's advice, and so he makes a special trip to her home up in Donington Park. He's there on the 12th of October, and her advice to him, much like it had been earlier about the Calvinists, was keep silence and leave the matter to God. That was her advice at the moment. That's in a shorthand section in the manuscript journal. We know of developments over the next 3 months from Howell Harris's diary. On the 20th of December, 1744, Harris was part of a discussion in London with the Countess, who had now come down to London with her husband for Parliament, and with James Erskine. they learned that accusations against Charles had reached the Bishop of London. This news shocked Lady Huntingdon, lest it, quote, prejudice all against us. Notice, the issue is not what it means for Charles, it's what it means for us, the evangelical renewal movement in the Church of England. Accordingly, she approached Edmund Gibson, current Bishop of London, seeking to head off the danger. When she did so, she found the bishop amenable to clearing Charles, but he raised another concern. Gibson had just published an attack on Methodist preaching outside of parish churches in the field and without permission of Church of England priests assigned to the parish. And he stressed to her how he could not accept that. This helps explain Charles's next encounter with Lady Huntingdon, which he recorded in his journal, but again in shorthand only. On the 3rd of January, 1745, he says, I received a summons from my, quote, friend that was, not my best of friend, but my friend that was, with due indifference, yet thought it my duty to go to in justice to my own character. At the meeting, Lady Huntingdon expressed her concern about the charges of immorality, and Wesley declared his innocence. The Countess allowed that she found it difficult to believe the charges, but she did not overtly affirm his innocence. In turn, Wesley says, I found power to suspend my judgment of her so as neither to condemn nor justify her. And they walked apart. At that point, well, they didn't walk apart yet, because at that point in that conversation, Lady Huntingdon shifted the conversation to the importance of submitting to episcopal authority in upholding church order, that is, refraining from field preaching, something she had encouraged him to do in Newcastle. Charles pushed back, reminding her how those to whom order was entrusted had countenanced mob attacks upon his brother and other Methodist preachers in places like Wednesbury. And according to Charles, the Countess then, quote, fired up so as to lose all charge of herself. So he, quote, left her without trouble or regret, period. There's no record of contact between Wesley and Lady Huntingdon over the next 3 weeks, until James Erskine, as her envoy, conveyed the message from the Bishop of London that if I would come to him and declare my innocency touching the scandals, he would clear me. The next day, Lady Huntingdon attended Sunday worship at West Street Chapel. In a letter to Howell Harris, Erskine stressed that Charles not only preached but presided over the full liturgy, all with the Lord's blessing, which Erskine took as a sign of divine vindication of Charles. But what Charles records about that service in his journal, again in shorthand, was our old friend came, as it were, to take her leave of the chapel. And indeed, that's the last time we have any record of her attending West Street Chapel. Charles wrote a letter to the Bishop of London disavowing fornication with any woman, but he received no answer. This is likely because both Thomas Williams and the women involved had recounted their accusations. They had said, no, those were made up. But Charles's vindication did not restore friendship or relationship with his friend that was, because Lady Huntingdon's heightened concern about conforming to the Church of England polity remained to be addressed. Hence, the meeting of both Wesley brothers with her on the 23rd of May, 1745, which Charles records in his journal, again, only in shorthand. She urged us, who would believe it, to confess our fault of preaching the gospel and to submit to the bishops. When the brothers demurred, it drew out all the old nature and set her pride in a flame, and Charles reports that he looked upon her and heard her with the proper affection of grief and pity, and their relationship was broken. It would be 1751, 6 years later, before Charles responded positively to overtures from Lady Huntingdon to resume their friendship. Now, the importance of those 6 years is that's the period during which Lady Huntingdon comes to reject the teaching of entire Christian perfection in this life. Charles isn't there as a conversation partner with her through those. Developments on both sides set the stage for them reconciling by 1751. In a 1785 letter, Charles described his relationship with his brother John as being, quote, friends from childhood and, quote, fellow laborers for over 50 years. He went on to say, notice he only calls it friend, not best of friends, that's important. He went on to say that while their labors together had been dissolved by John's recent decision to ordain some of his lay preachers, their friendship would continue until death. Note, he does not describe John as his best of friends, but only a friend. Indeed, earlier in the letter, Charles indicated their relationship was never fully mutual. John, quote, always had the ascendancy over me, unquote. More relevant to our account is that this summary skimmed quietly over 2 decades when both the partnership and the friendship of the brothers was greatly strained. So let's go back to 1745 and watch what really happened. Charles' immediate response to the loss of Lady Huntingdon as his best of friends was to immerse himself in labor alongside John in the proliferating Methodist societies in England, Wales, and after 1747 in Ireland. In that process, he met Sarah Gwynn, and eventually he married Sarah Gwynn. And as a result of that marriage, the couple settled in Bristol, and Charles became increasingly hesitant to spend extended time away from his family on preaching tours. To John's great chagrin, we found a draft of a letter where John writes and says, I can't understand any reason you'd stay more than a week. Well, that's what John proved to do later. Soon John was contemplating marriage as well, and Charles's intervention in John's intended marriage to Grace Murray in late 1749 is well known. John was devastated by Charles's actions and the loss of a spouse that John believed was a match for both his life and his ministry. In the aftermath, John took Charles's wife, Sarah, aside and read her his account of the proceedings, not Charles's account, but his account of what Charles had done, an act that Charles viewed as aimed at creating discord among the couple. And indeed, Charles suggested it was the result of the poison that John cast upon their cup of temporal blessing that Sarah's first pregnancy ended in miscarriage 2 months later. The resulting alienation between the brothers was palpable. And you see this both in things that are there and things that are missing. They met face-to-face that year only for a few days in September in London as Charles acceded to make a preaching tour to the north, which he then injured his foot and couldn't do, and so he went back to Bristol. And over that year, while the brothers before had exchanged 10 to 12 letters a year, most of them with personal comments, the few written in 1750 were strictly informational in nature. Here's what you need to know. Adding to their alienation was John's marriage to Mary Goldhawk Vizale in 1751, a union about which John never consulted Charles nor invited him to attend the wedding. Charles was aghast. He would eventually try to draw together and reconcile, but when they had a meeting to seek reconciliation, John asked Charles to return full-time to being a traveling minister. And Charles said no. Now, Charles was not rejecting ministry in Methodist settings. He stayed in London for 2 months after that meeting, serving in those chapels that Wesley had bought, where you needed an ordained person to be there to preside so you could have Eucharist. So Charles took it as his duty when John was out of London to go to London and help meet that task. But what he was refusing to do was to give John final word in where he would serve. Charles's actions related to Grace Murray laid bare John's sense of the authority he held in, quote, his wing of Methodism. At a conference between the brothers in November 1749, mediated by Vincent Pernay, John cast the option as either he would have ultimate authority or none at all. He would either be unquestioned in his judgments or he would leave England for North America. Faced with that alternative, Charles stepped into the background. His refusal in March 1751 reiterated this stance and left him in need of supportive friends. And Lady Huntingdon was in similar need. Her husband had died. She had been able to draw George Whitefield back to England so that he could be someone to assist her. She had Howell Harris to assist her. Indeed, Harris was the one who persuaded Whitefield to come. In response, Whitefield had Harris kicked out of the movement because he wasn't ordained. And he served no longer in England. He over in Wales he did, but not in England from that point on in that movement. But then Frederick, son of King George II, died on the 31st of March, 1751. Why that's important is that Lady Huntingdon had connections to the prince, and Whitefield was convinced she could convince the prince to have him ordained a bishop. Once the prince was gone, Whitefield, it was clear to him, my hopes of being a bishop are gone, so he volunteered for another trip to North America. And that left her needing support and workers in her concern for the evangelical revival in the Church of England. If the Calvinists weren't there, or not enough of them, who could she reach to? Well, who better? She tried John Wesley. That one didn't work. He told her to her face what he would do and wouldn't do, and she withdrew the chance. So she reached out again to Charles. She had just moved to the Bristol area. And in late May 1751, Charles was informed by an intermediary that she wanted to meet. By his account, she expressed great kindness toward me, and my heart was turned back again and forgot all that was past. And they sealed the reconciliation in prayer. 2 days later, Charles introduced his wife Sarah to the Countess, where our old friend appeared as such and was particularly drawn to Sarah. So whereas Sarah was an obstacle between John and Charles, Sarah brought together Lady Huntingdon and Charles. During that same time, James Wheatley reports came of him having improper relationships with women. And that drew John Wesley down to Bristol, and that allowed Charles to introduce John and his wife Mary to Lady Huntingdon. And for a while, it might look like there would be a chance of her working with both brothers. But it proved before long that there was no such chance. At least two things mediated against it. One of the things that mediated against it was Charles' growing criticism of lay preachers. When the charges against Wheatley were drawn up, Charles made a visit to Bradford-on-Avon to interview women on the charge, and during the time he took away the license of a, quote, worthless, senseless, graceless lay preacher his brother had approved. And that set him up for, what are we going to do about this? Charles convinces John they need to do something about the lay preachers. John said, okay, then if you will go on a trip, if you will do a preaching tour up into Northwest, investigate the lay preachers. Charles agreed to do it. He took off, and during that trip, he decided what we need to do is rein in John's authority. We need to reduce his control of the preachers, and that way we need to require that all lay preachers have to be approved by both John and me. He wrote this all up in a letter and sent it to Lady Huntingdon. Unfortunately, the letter got intercepted and delivered to John. And the response, as you might imagine, was not positive. Finally, John said, I will let you, Charles, continue to work in the movement as long as you will itinerate at least a third of each year. And I traced through this part of the written piece, and I'll just mention it real briefly here. Charles, for several years, tried that. He would serve a third of the year and then the rest of the time in Bristol. But it kept getting interrupted by other struggles. In particular, lay preachers began to try to offer sacraments. John was willing. He said to Charles, in essence, we've already ordained him, let's just give him a license. And Charles said, no way, and he organized the resistance, and this leads then to John finally being under pressure, forced to write, shall we separate from the church? Is separation from the church an option? And to answer no, and get the conference to vote no. In all of those complaints, it was Lady Huntingdon who Charles wrote to for advice as he's trying to lobby. See, Lady Huntingdon to Charles is his support for maintaining evangelicalism within the Church of England over against what he sees as his brother's increasing move to take it out of the Church of England. The way Charles put it one time is, my brother sees himself as a Methodist first and then an elder in the Church of England. I see myself as an elder and then a Methodist. And Lady Huntingdon at that point, Charles saw as supporting her. So that was one of the things that made it impossible for the three of them to work together. The other thing was Mary Wesley. John's marriage to Mary Vizelle proved to be an unfortunate one. He should have remained single. She proved to be, at times, a source of tension and trouble. After she met Charles's wife, she actually wrote him a letter where she said, "You've let that songbird take control over you so that you're not out there giving time in ministry supporting your brother. Instead, you're there taking care of that woman." You can imagine that didn't go well in terms of Charles and his relationship to Sarah. So that the relationship between John, Charles, and Mary was drawn. Indeed, it reached the point where Charles was in London in December of 1755 to meet the Bishop of London to seek a parish church appointment. Now, while there, he was encouraged once more to try to hold Methodism together, and he tried. He went to conference that year. But the letter he wrote once he got back from his trip said, quote, "Mrs. John Wesley took her opportunity while my brother was in Ireland of laying hands on my income, taking away the £100 a year that they had been guaranteed, with an eye to set me upon my brother and occasion a quarrel, if not separation." This accounts for the lack of correspondence between the two brothers from late 1756 to early 1759. They're not even writing each other now, or at least none survive. That brings me to the point in the lecture that I'll touch with real quickly, realigning of their relationship. Through to 1770, Charles continues to see himself primarily as related to Lady Huntingdon more than to his brother. But that relationship is changing. At first, they'd been co-laborers. As we watch things develop, Lady Huntingdon increasingly takes on the role of being peeress of the evangelical revival, of being the head of it, of wanting to be at the top controlling things, whether that be building a school for the preachers at Trevecca or building her own chapels, which, interestingly, she didn't license as dissenting chapels. She required they use the Book of Common Prayer, etc., but she also didn't put them under the control of the bishop. She decided who would serve there. She recruited the clergy. She began to operate as kind of a bishop in petticoats, is what one called her, with that. Now, how this bothered Charles is that increasingly the one who he saw as his support in keeping evangelicalism within the church was herself becoming an independent. As late as May 1768, an associate of Lady Huntingdon informed her that Charles Wesley had the design of moving from Bristol to Bath so that he could supply the leadership for her ladyship's chapel, the one she had built there in Bath. Over the next few months, the Countess tried to persuade him, but Charles ended up instead relocating to London for the sake of his musical sons. That same year, George Whitefield died, and that meant that the relationship Lady Huntingdon had was less with this somewhat moderate Whitefield and more with more radical predestinarian Calvinists. And it created the context in which then, when in the conference in 1770, when John Wesley gathered his preachers, and they adopted a statement at the end of their minutes asking, "How have we come too close to Calvinism?" and then did a critique of several points of Calvinism, that things exploded. Charles Wesley recognized what was being lost with Whitefield gone, with this explosion taking place. In a letter to Lady Huntingdon in early December 1770, he lamented how the alliance formed 4 years earlier between her, himself, his brother John, and George Whitefield, that the four of them would stand together and they would fill the pulpits of her churches and carry on the movement, that had fallen apart. Whitefield was now, quote, safe landed, that is, dead, while John had given little thought to the alliance from that day to this, and was now removed an immeasurable distance. But Charles added that he hoped that he and the Countess would remain at peace for the rest of their life. That peace ended June 3, 1771, when Lady Huntingdon sent Charles the first copy of a circular just published that she had her cousin write, Walter Shirley, that reproduced the 1770 minutes criticizing Calvinism and called for all, quote, real Protestants to gather in Bristol in early August at the time of John Wesley's annual conference with his preachers in order to deliver a rebuttal to that group and call for a formal recantation of the 1770 statement. In the letter that accompanied this that she sent to Charles, Lady Huntingdon characterized the 1770 statement as, quote, popery, contrary to the fundamental principles of the Church of England and all Reformed and Protestant churches in the world. Charles's reaction survives in the endorsement he added at the end of the letter. That endorsement was, Lady Huntingdon's last, June 3, 1771, unanswered by John Wesley's brother. In other words, in this debate, I stand in real union with John. And his next surviving letter to his brother included the news that, quote, our old friend was now calling John a heretic and an apostate. At this point, we watch then where John becomes again the one that Charles has to lean on as his support in the work he's doing, even though he's not fully comfortable with some of the directions John's leading it. This final transition is not as abrupt as it might seem. At the time they became best of friends, Lady Huntingdon expressed no doubt about the orthodoxy of Charles or his brother. As she shifted more and more overtly to Calvinism, Charles expressed concerns at times that she was drawing away some of his converts after her, but he remained content as long as she allowed that the differences between the Calvinist and the Wesleyan wings of the evangelical revival did not concern fundamental doctrines, and lent her support to efforts for greater union between the wings. The letter of June 1771 made clear that this was no longer her stance. Similarly, one of the things that Charles valued about Lady Huntingdon in the 1750s was her aid in countering her brother's prioritization of his Methodist connection over the Church of England and the resulting potential for separation. As the Countess increasingly assumed the role of peeress over her evangelical initiatives through the 1760s, Charles clearly sensed her moving toward a stance analogous to his brother's. And indeed, in March 1783, a year before John ordained lay preachers, Lady Huntingdon presided over, she didn't herself do the ordination, but presided over the ordination of 6 of her Trevecca students, separating most of her connection formally from the Church of England. The 1771 marked for Charles Wesley not merely the decisive cooling of his relationship with a former best of friend, but the loss of a co-laborer in cultivating a broadly evangelical renewal within the Church of England. Conversely, continuing tensions between Charles and his brother John, particularly around the lay preachers, rendered Charles an increasingly isolated champion of church Methodism over the last years of his life. And Garrett Lloyd has told much of that story. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Randy, for this lecture that raises so many questions that go far beyond the story, into the theology, the thinking, the organization, and all of that. But now it's your turn to ask questions, and we will have questions both from folks online who will be typing them into the chat boxes. We'll, from time to time, take one from there, and
Yeah, you need to go to the
so everybody will get their turn to, well, not everybody get their turn, but you'll have some questions. So, who wants to start? Yes.
Go ahead, Peter, yeah.
Peter?
That's brilliant, Ryan. Thank you very much. I wonder if there's anything more to be made of Lady Huntingdon's position as a peeress and her position within the Church of England and the right she had to appoint chaplains, and I think some proprietorial rights about chapels, and whether then Charles Wesley's sort of social ambition to having married into a property family.
Yeah. Well, yeah, very good question. The question then is the Lady Huntingdon's role as peeress and how Charles was being drawn in some ways, seeking her support and protection. Very much so. In one of his early letters, after they had come back together in 1751, he says that what he valued about it is it would allow him to leave his widow in her care. So that when he was 20 years older, he knew he would die before Sarah. Who's going to care for Sarah? Well, who better than someone that has money? Lady Huntingdon. The interesting tension, I think, is that as peeress, she did have the right to appoint chaplains as private chaplains in her home. What she was doing was going a step further, building chapels where worship would be held. Now, if she had made that a chapel of ease, then she had said, okay, I'm going to pay to build the chapel, but the bishop will have control over who preaches there. But what she's doing is she's holding a public service where she's deciding who will be the person preaching. And Charles preached at her place in that a lot. John preached there 3 times at least. She was reaching out to both Reformed and Arminian early on. As things heated up, she increasingly reduced it to only those that were affirming her understanding of the Anglican article on predestination. Good.
Are there any letters between Sarah and Lady Huntingdon that you know of?
I've seen one, and it's just a letter expressing thanks for a recent visit and the care given. There's not Sarah Wesley, Charles's wife, tends to write fairly short letters and primarily to her husband when he's away from home. Or at least these are the ones that have survived. Now, part of what we deal with is the letters we have are the ones that the family kept and then handed down. So you'll get extended accounts of what's going on with the kids in Bristol to Charles. But the letters that she writes, and when she writes to her sisters, she'll tend to give accounts of how all their nieces and nephews are doing. But in terms of correspondence with someone like Lady Huntingdon, it's usually only around an official or a visit we've had or something like that. And they're fairly few.
We've got one from an online listener.
Dr. Maddox, this is from a former student, Aaron Hayworth.
Oh, yeah.
And he's asking, how does this friendship guide modern Wesleyans in pursuing meaningful relationships with Calvinist interlocutors, and how might we navigate the difference? And then he asks the follow-up question of why is it important for specific religious systems and theological orientations to develop relationships with others?
Well, I mean, the theological dimension, the crucial thing is whether you understand the points at which you differ to be points that are opinions where there's room for difference, or whether they're core doctrines. And on that, folk differ. And so for a wide range of folk who would be moderately Calvinist, to have a conversation with someone who's Wesleyan Arminian is not an issue. But for someone who makes that the key doctrine, it's going to be very hard. The more important point I make is this, that early in the lecture, I was trying to point out, how do people who may have somewhat differing views, how do they actually build a relationship? And it'll be around ways in which you reach out to support one another, you participate with each other in ministry to others. So you'll be looking at how do we together do a Habitat for Humanity project or whatever. You don't assume that you can build a relationship simply about sitting down to talk about your differences. It has to be built on something that's more engaged than that.
From a lot of the work I've done, it seems that Charles is only able to maintain a very, very close friendship one at a time. So I have a twofold question there. The first part is, was it common for those kinds of friendships during this time to be between opposite sex, especially with the intimacy with which they communicate in the letters? And then secondarily, do you think he would have fallen in love with Sarah if he had not fallen out with Lady Huntingdon? I know they had different kinds of relationship, but he seems...
Oh, yeah, well, there was... I've never found any inclination that Charles's attachment or drawn to Lady Huntingdon had anything to do with them as a partnership in that sense. She was already married, and of a very different social class. But the idea of having close spiritual friendships, including with members of the opposite sex, was common. In that sense, that's what he was looking for there. Whether he would have returned to the kind of traveling with John that would have led him to meet his wife, Sarah Wesley, is an open question. That may not have happened if there had not been this break. If the relationship had continued to nurture between him and her as his supporter, peerless friend, would he have returned to full-time service with his brother or not is unclear. And then, okay, did that get to both points? So one, whether is common, and then with that, yeah. Now, the other point, did they tend to restrict it to, actually, Charles had a couple other folk that he was fairly close with Vincent Perronnet, but usually that was conveyed in conversations. But when he was actually seeking to persuade Sarah Gwynn's mother to let him marry, it's Perronnet that he goes to and who keeps writing letters in his behalf and stuff. So it could be more than one, but Charles does tend to be a more indrawn person who it'd only be a few close relationships versus the kind of person who's always out there broad but thin in their connections. Good.
Another one?
I think we've got one over here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks. I find it really helpful to hear that it's in a way what you've said is against the risk we have of reifying leaders. Mm-hmm. You've showed us that these are humans who wax and wane, they oscillate in different things. That was a real positive I took from it, and I appreciate that, and I feel like we need to hear that. I was wondering about the shorthand and whether you've noticed now you've learned the shorthand, if there are particular themes of what he chooses to put in shorthand or not.
Yeah. A lot of the time when Charles does shorthand is simply because it's faster when he's making drafts. So for example, we have a lot of his hymns, an original draft of them will be in shorthand. And then he'll come back and do a longhand version and then further corrections. Because the shorthand is quite a bit quicker to write down and takes much less paper to write down. When you get to something like the manuscript journal, which Charles was putting it together, he put this together in 1751. He was getting ready to publish it as a defense of his character in light of the accusations being brought against him and that kind of thing. In that, he writes it out, but the juicy sections, the sections that could be, to his mind, misread and show either tension with it between him and his brother or whatever, that he had even been accused of these things, those all go into shorthand in the manuscript journal. So there it's clearly being done to protect it. Some of the letters that Charles writes to his brother John, likewise, if they're worried about him getting intercepted, they'll either switch and put part of it in Greek, or they'll do it in shorthand, but John didn't know the shorthand nearly as well as Charles. So in one of them, Charles at the end says, and please learn the shorthand better so we can communicate this way and keep it private. Yeah.
Let's go for one more online, and then we'll come back to you.
This one's regarding what you said about Charles viewing Lady Huntingdon as a co-laborer early on in their friendship. Was there ever any language similar to what John would have used to justify the lay preachers of extraordinary calling, or can you add a little color to that? And then was it just Charles's incredulity towards what seeming like fracturing with the Church of England that caused him to maybe change his mind in that later in the 1750s?
Well, that's a great question, because in some ways I think her status as of the nobility, the nobility have both an expectation and a role in British life of caring for those in their village or whatever, and that kind of thing. So when Charles says we're co-laborers, I think he could say that in a way that didn't assume it was only at the same level as ordained persons would be, where you're co-laborers in a ministry. She was, some of the early journal letters she writes back to Charles, she'll talk about how I went down to the village, I visited this woman was sick, I got some medical and things like that. All of that was ministry, and Charles saw that as ministry. It's the kind of thing he was doing often among the colliers, etc. But he clearly recognized that there were limits to what they could do together in labor that way, that he would be able to do things like the sacraments that she couldn't. But when they needed help with more ordained persons, once John Wesley opened up what ended up being 3 different chapels in London, where they were celebrating by Book of Common Prayer, and as much as possible every week with Eucharist, boy, you need help to do that. And John ended up recruiting folk who would come in because they had ordination, at least as deacon to help or as elder to serve. And he was just appointing them to spend full time in London, not to travel the circuit, because they had to be there to help cover these chapels. Well, that's when, for example, he draws on Lady Huntingdon to get Thomas Maxfield, a lay preacher, ordained so that he can assist the good Mr. John Wesley. And there are others like that. So Charles could reach out to her to get more ordained help, but he didn't expect her to play that role. But I do think from what I've seen that in addition to their clear disagreement after 1770 over the predestination controversy, that what built the ground that made it easier for Charles to say, we're done, is that she had ceased to be a clear ally in trying to work hard to keep the evangelical renewal part of the Church of England, and that she was becoming her connection first, Church of England second, or moving in that direction. And Charles wanted no part of that.
He's going to divorce his brother.
Yeah. This is why, for example, Charles didn't want to be buried at Wesley's chapel in London. He wanted to be buried at the parish church, because I'm an Anglican first, not a Methodist.
Thank you very much for this. I'm wondering to what extent, if at all, the swings and roundabouts of the relationship affected the way, the tone and content of Charles's hymns that they're being written at the same time.
Ah. Well, it's interesting, a couple of things. It's after he and John have begun to differ on these issues, and particularly around church connection, that Charles returns to and tries to complete a project of writing hymns on all the Psalms, to have a metric psalter that could be used in worship. The notion that that was an important thing to do is much more important to the Charles, who's an Anglican, than it is to the John, who's a Methodist, for whom the hymns that aren't tied so closely to those texts would be. And it's also, by 1760, and it could well be that I don't have the documents to prove this, but it could be that Charles' growing questioning of the emphasis on perfection, or even the third blessing, that brings the stable mind, being an instantaneous experience claimed by faith. Charles, by 1762 and 3, when he's writing shorthand on Scripture, has come to reject that. And the influence of Lady Huntingdon, who had come to reject that earlier, could well have played a role in that.
Thanks. I had a question related to that. One of the major episodes in Methodism during the time period you were looking at is this perfectionist revivals, which you just referred to in the 1760s, where some Wesleyan Methodists were claiming sinless perfection. Is there evidence of, with actually both Charles and Lady Huntingdon rejected, is there evidence of them interacting around that? And just add another quick kind of follow-up with Joshua's question. Do you think Charles saw Lady Huntingdon as a unique kind of case in early Methodism in terms of the scope of her ministry as a woman, or do you see other cases where Charles is encouraging women to minister in kind of similar or parallel ways?
Let's start with the second one and then come back. If you look at the letters Charles writes to Sarah Perrin and others, to other lay women who were interested, he could encourage them as well to be out there in some kinds of social helping ministries. Now, there were very few that he knew who were members of the nobility that he had close enough relationship to see them. There were a couple, and he himself draws support from some of them, both financial. Once he marries and he's only getting the £100 a year, he needs money, and there are some that help him in that way. But in terms of women in ministry, Charles was hesitant with the claims, as far as I can see, the claims of Mary Bosanquet and others that God has, by the blessing of our services, empowered us, and we must proclaim, whether it's in the band meetings or later in open ways. He was not as prone as John to see that as being justified. Going to the controversy over perfectionism, or in particular the third blessing, that you not only are saved and sanctified, but that you receive a blessing that gives such soundness of mind that you won't fall. I don't think Lady Huntingdon would have ever accepted it, but she was not disinclined to accept Thomas Maxfield serving in one of her chapels in London because he had ordination. And for her, she could let that slide as long as he did that. And so when he leaves John's ranks, he sets up his own, but he also serves at time in various chapels for Lady Huntingdon. Charles, by that point, he sees that as a deception that's leading you astray. That may be in part because Charles, for all of his life, is always talking about how I long to know, how can I know? He never quite reaches a place where he say, okay, I have the assurance that endures. I pray and I long for it. Yeah. Good.
Any other questions? Any more online? One quick one I can just think of. Why do you think that John asked Lady Huntingdon to burn the letters?
So the question is, why did Charles ask Lady Huntingdon to burn the letters? I think early on that was because he knew his being in conversations with someone who was perceived as in the other camp could be troublesome. John was also less comfortable with Charles appealing primarily to the gentry. Instead, I mean, Charles would preach to the colliers and all, but he was much more at home among the gentry. And so I think it was ways that he wanted to be able to share, but not have it come back to bite him. And that had happened in the past. I mean, a letter between him and John in Georgia had gotten intercepted and had come back to bite them, etc. And so Charles tried to be careful with personal correspondence that it not be found and used later. Didn't always work. That letter to Lady Huntingdon about reining in John's authority that got to John instead, yes.
Follow on from that. I've always been curious about Charles Wesley's writing on that last letter, Lady Huntingdon's last, unanswered by John Wesley's brother. What a strange way to write on it. I mean,
Yeah.
Is Charles Wesley actually trying to say that?
It is kind of strange. And if you go back to that 1785 letter where he said, John and I were always friends, we're no longer co-laborers because of the ordination, I think it's important he says John Wesley's brother. It's not a matter of who's my closest friend, but on this, I stand with John, and after all, we're brothers. And it's a striking annotation he puts on there. Several of Charles's annotations on his letters are very revealing. You watch that when you look at transcriptions of his letters. Always look to see the letters coming into him in particular. What did he note about them on him? Good. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for a delightful evening, giving us things to think about for a while. It's much appreciated. Right now, it's I guess we can just kind of relax and talk as we enjoy each other's company, and look forward to seeing you here next year, same time, same place. Yeah. Oh, yes, there are refreshments next door. Oh, life is good. There are refreshments next door. I had not realized that they were going to continue, so this is good news for me too.